Grief is a natural part of life. I actually did a video about grief last week. As we go through life and we lose people that we love, there is a certain level of grief, and we see in today's lesson that it's okay to take the time that you need to grieve and to also honor the lives of the people who are lost and to treasure those memories, and also to take the time again that you need to deal with it and also to be able to move on. And once again, it's always a pleasure to be here for the Sanctuary Sunday School powered by the Sanctuary Academy. And this week we're talking about David, and this is David's grief for Saul and Jonathan. And as we know, David was a faithful follower of King Saul, and Jonathan, who was Saul's son, was a dear friend. And at this time, David was not there in the palace anymore because Saul had attempted to kill him and David had to leave. And the Philistines had come up against Israel and they defeated him. And it says the archers, first they had already killed Jonathan and his brothers, and then the archers had hit Saul, and Saul was wounded. And what actually happened is that he asked his armor bearer to go ahead and kill him so that the Philistines wouldn't be able to come and take him and make him a prisoner and torture him and do all these things to him. So the armor bearer would not kill Saul because Saul was God's anointed and he was afraid to kill him. So the word says that Saul fell upon his own sword and he died. So Saul and his 3 sons died. And this is also part of the prophecy and the judgment that God had pronounced upon the house of Saul because of his disobedience. God took the kingdom away. So now Saul is dead and his sons are dead, so that none of them can assume the throne. And this is where we are in this lesson. And so now we have one of the Amalekites that came to tell David of Saul's demise. And it's kind of funny on what he did here, because when he told David about it, David was upset. And he asked him, he said, well, how do you know? And for some reason, this person made it seem like he killed Saul, and he brought his crown and everything to David. And now David was his Lord because Saul was dead. And I guess because of the history and because of the way that Saul had treated David, in the end, he assumed that that would probably get him into good graces with David, which was not the case. The word says here that David mourned and he wept and he fasted for Saul and Jonathan. And this speaks volumes about David's character. Sometimes we're so self-centered and self-consumed until it's all about me. He hurt my feelings. They talked about me. They made me feel bad. And now I can't function and we don't see any value. But David still loved Saul and he was still loyal to Saul in spite of everything that had transpired. And again, Jonathan, Saul's son, was David's trusted friend. And so then he went back to deal with this person who said that he had killed Saul. He said, who are you and why weren't you afraid to kill God's anointed? And that right there, that's a lesson in and of itself. And I can speak from personal experience because being in a position of being a pastor's daughter, I see what you would call a lot of dirt. And we're living in a day now where everybody wants to call out the pastor or call out the bishop, or, we're taping things, we're publishing videos, trying to take people down. This lesson right here addresses that. It was not David's place, nor was it the servant's place to harm Saul based on anything that he had done. David referred to Saul as God's anointed. God has anointed anointed Saul. When someone is called and anointed by God and they fall from grace and they don't live up to their anointing, that is between them and God. And you do not want to be the person who steps in the middle of that. You do what God told you to do, and you let God handle his business with his anointed. And we see that David had this man killed. And in so many words, if you would kill, if you're not afraid, if you would come and tell me that you killed King Saul, I'm not going to embrace you in my camp. You can't be in my court. I can't trust you. You don't have the character of someone that I want working with me. And again, that's a very, very powerful lesson, because sometimes you think that you got to undercut somebody else in order to get what's due to you. God is too big for that. God has enough. My mom, that's the last thing she said when she testified. Her last testimony was, God has something for everybody, and he has enough for everybody. I ain't got to take what's yours. I don't have to attack you in order to get what's mine. So then he had this man killed. And then he told him, he said, you know what? Don't go out and broadcast this. Don't go and tell everybody about what happened. Because if you do that, then these uncircumcised Philistines are going to think that they triumph. And they're going to think that they have a victory. Because see, David knew this battle wasn't over, because he knew of the anointing that God had placed on his life. So he didn't want them to think that they had done some great thing and that they would be victorious because of this battle that they had won. The war wasn't over, and with God, you always have the victory. And that's another lesson right there, because sometimes we'll give up a premature victory to the enemy when the battle is not even over. God is still fighting on our behalf, and we're trying to surrender. And so this is what David is saying. Don't go broadcast this, because this is not over. And so he said that what they would do is then try to downplay this and cast Saul down as if he was not even ever anointed by God. But he was anointed by God. And the Spirit of God and the power of God was still with his people. And it was just a matter of time before God rose up David to be anointed to allow him to avenge his people. And then David began to pay tribute to Saul and to Jonathan. And he said that they were lovely and they were strong and that they were swift and mighty. Now, you may ask yourself, how can David sit here and say such positive things and remain loyal to Saul after Saul literally hunted him to kill him? And this is powerful, because you can't judge someone's entire being or entire life by a season in their life and poor decisions that they made. Saul was a mighty king anointed by God. He was appointed to be king over God's people, and he was a mighty warrior. Even though Saul lost God's blessing and he sought to kill David, you cannot take away the great things that he did as king. And sometimes we want to just throw away people because of a bad season or a series of bad decisions or things that they did against us. Just because you hurt my feelings, just because you were against me, doesn't mean that you're no good and of no value. David, and that's such a good lesson, David was still able to recognize the value and the contribution that Saul had made to the people of Israel. And then he talked about Jonathan and how hurt he was, because he said, now Jonathan was good to me, right? Okay, Saul was great. He was powerful. He was an anointed man of God in his day. But Jonathan, that was my friend. He loved me. He saved my life. He was good to me. And he expressed hurt and grief over losing Jonathan. And he said, the mighty have fallen. And he was talking about how the weapons of war, had overpowered them. And this was the end of an era. And this was the end of a season. And even though, again, there were some tough times between Saul and David had to flee for his life. But at the same time, he undoubtedly had precious memories and good times in the palace of King Saul. And that is where he got his training and where he was prepared to ascend to the throne of a united Israel which is what we're going to see in our next lesson. But today, we're closing this lesson with David's grief for Saul and Jonathan.